Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to A Purpose Driven Life channel. My name is Trista, and in today's video, we're going to talk about wine. Stated in my intro, we are going to talk about wine, and this particular wine has no alcohol. It's a Merlot, if you can see that. This is a Merlot, and it has a very tart taste, but let me just prove to you that it is 0% alcohol. Let me see if it can, yeah, there we go. It has a very tart taste. It has a taste of like juice, similar to like grape juice, but it's very tart. And that is what I love about it. So it's not like and I wanted to talk about that today on my channel. And I wanted to first talk about or showcase this video by J. Warner Wallace. He wrote this book, A Cold Case Christianity, and his story is that, well, first, he was featured, or he was on God's Not Dead 2, and he talks about it from a homicide detective position. Now, his story is that he was an atheist, and he was at church one day, and he heard a pastor say that Jesus was the smartest guy in the world. And he was like, what? And that caught his attention, that Jesus was the smartest guy in the world. And he wanted to go out and prove it. And so he went about it through a homicide detective aspect, because as a homicide, that's what he did as a job. He was a homicide detective, and basically what he would do is old cases that would come across his desk, and this was like old cases that were like in the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s, and a lot of the cases were so unsolved cases that came across his desk. And so he had to go based on the evidence that was presented to him, and he went that, and so the way that he did it the same way in reading the Bible. So just like in the Bible, we can't go back and ask Matthew or Luke about the account. That is how this book came about, and then he shows you how he did it, discovering how Jesus really is the smartest guy in the world, and he became a Christian just based on some of his findings. So there's a video that I'm about to show you where he showcases or talks about a Christian that is in a situation where there is a family of people that are smoking weed. And so this particular guest that is on the podcast with J. Warner Wallace, and that answers this topic of weed and wine.
Bible say about smoking weed as a Christian. I started dating this guy a few months ago, and he had me come over for a family dinner with one other married couple and his folks. After the meal, we were all having a good time. There were questions asked from this couple about Jesus. So clearly, my guy and his family are trying to be there for this couple to answer any biblical questions. Well, shortly after answering a couple of questions, this other couple passed around a pipe, and everyone smoked except me. I was shocked, uncomfortable, felt like running away right then, because the guy I'm dating and his family say they're walking believers and have been for 20 plus years. I don't know what to think. When I told him how uncomfortable I felt, he acted shocked. He said he was raised that it was not a taboo thing. He also mentions it's just a social thing that he and his family do. This was the first time I've ever seen his family, so this was a shock of an introduction. I was raised knowing it's against the law, wrong, not a healthy thing to do. I've been a walking Bible believer my whole life. Yes, I've sinned, but I've never encountered a Bible-believing family who all smoke weed and not bat an eye at it. I'm so heartbroken and confused on what to think. This guy and his family are loving, easy to talk to, have biblical knowledge, and are just incredible people. What should I do? Bobby.
Ask the, ex-pot smoker, right?
Aren't you glad we have Bobby here today? Because no one else is going to say a thing on this question except for the ex-pot smoker. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, in the scriptures, we don't see anything about, smoking weed. You'll have some who will make the desperate case, that God has given all seed to us, and you think, oh, come on, that doesn't mean that there's an endorsement from Yahweh to go and burn a bowl. So how are we to understand what we're to do with this particular situation? Well, I think that the principles of self-control would apply in the arena of smoking weed in the same way that it would with alcohol. We happen to live in a culture which is interesting, where legalized marijuana is taking place. And so this is going to be a big debate in the church, right? Because some would argue, if you had to have one thing legal over the other, like would alcohol or marijuana, what would cause more crime in a culture, alcoholism or people who smoke pot? Well, both are wrong, to be getting high and to be getting drunk. Then the question comes is, okay, well, if somebody's just using edibles and they're just taking 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams or whatever it is, they're taking lower dosages, is that okay? And, so you'll have some Christians that will say, you know what, it feels equivalent to having like a glass of beer or 2 glasses of beer. So they might try to say that then it's okay. And then you'll talk about, medical marijuana. Can it be used medicinally? And that brings up another question on the moral front. So all of a sudden, it's like there's people in prison who are doing time for, marijuana crimes in a culture where it's now legal. I don't know if they've all been forgiven here in California, Jim, so maybe you could speak to that in a moment.
We'll talk about that later.
But as we kind of think about this case with marijuana, I do think that obviously we're to be self-controlled. We're to be filled with the Holy Spirit. We aren't to be intoxicated whatsoever. So I think if people are as professed Christians and they're passing around a bong and they're taking bong hits in front of somebody, I think that I could understand why she's confused, right? So what could be the approach? Well, obviously we could be praying for the person. It doesn't mean the person isn't lost. They're not really modeling really a Christ-centered life with their bong hits as a family. Now, one thing that I would say, as it relates to medicinal usage, imagine if we lived in a world where you never had any of the baggage of marijuana, and you were to wake up in the morning and it said on the front of your newspaper, scientists have discovered a new plant that can help with medicinal purposes. For example, cancer patients who can't keep food down, who are struggling, or people with severe anxiety disorders, and there's a way for this to be done in a minimal way. We wouldn't think anything of it. It's because of the baggage of the hippie movement and some of the other things. So, and I think not only that, many people who would condemn using it for medicinal purposes would have no problem getting a surgery and taking a bunch of codeine home with them as part of their pharmaceutical therapy to recover. So we get inconsistent in some of these ways, and we just really need to think through. So stepping back, the principles is this. We need to be sober-minded. We need to be self-controlled. We need to be alert. We're not to be intoxicated by anything. The question, though, that would be on the table is, if it's okay to have a couple glasses of wine, and you can do that in moderation, then is it okay if they can dose it out properly where you can have an equivalent of kind of something to curb your anxiety on a medicinal level? Is that okay? And that's a conversation that's happening right now, and you'll have some that are vehement on one side and others are passionate on the other.
Yeah, I think you're even to say that it's, to add the medicinal, forget about the medicinal aspect of it. Like if you're saying it's okay to have a glass of wine after dinner.
Exactly. Yes.
That's not for medicinal purposes. You just want to have a glass of wine. And for those, there's lots of folks within Christendom who would say, well, no, I'm not going to even take a first step in the direction of in sobriety. I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to avoid all alcohol. There's lots of denominations that would be their position, and I can understand that position. But the question is, look, forget about medicinal purposes. If it's okay to have a glass of wine, why couldn't I not get completely inebriated, but just reach the same level that I would reach with a glass of wine with marijuana if it is legal? And that's the question, right? And so for me, it's all about, it's the weaker brother issue.
Yeah.
So if I knew I was in a relationship, and this is something that I felt I was very much committed to a certain position on it, if it was on one side or the other. Yeah. And then the person I was dating, everyone on their family held the opposite position. The question is, are you willing to suspend the behavior so as not to stumble a weaker brother? Mm-hmm. Right? It's all in 1 Corinthians 8, right? Where we're talking about it, and you may feel like you've got actually good theological view on the issue, like the eating a meat from an idol, right? You've got a position that you can support theologically. You can support it on Scripture. Still, if the other person by this is somehow weakened would you do this in front of them? Mm-hmm. So I think really that's the bigger issue in a relationship. Because the question in the caller is not, well, what is the strict theological position here? It's what do I do in the context of this relationship? Is this the kind of dating relationship I want to go forward with?
Yeah.
But sometimes we're stumbling, right? Mm-hmm. But it's just because we need an explanation. So I'm not saying in this particular situation, but sometimes you're the weaker brother, and the weaker brother just needs an explanation, and they no longer feel weak. Right, sometimes the weaker brother is going to remain weak, even if you give the explanation, and that's where discernment can come.
Well, so that's what I think. Okay, so that's the case here. If, for example, she becomes convinced that, hey, you know what, this is going to be okay. I see it now, kind of like drinking a glass of wine. Okay, but then fine. Then she's going to move forward with that, and that's going to be her position. If she doesn't, though, then I think that she has to make a decision about going forward with somebody whose family would continually do this in front of her, even though they know it is a stumbling block for her.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's just a sign of how much that family cares about her, right? There's lots of stuff that, well, I won't do. Forget about, like, alcohol or marijuana. There's stuff that you won't even eat, right? If you got someone in your family and one of your kids is dating somebody who's vegan or is lactose intolerant or is, whatever it may be, you will change. You won't invite them over for dinner and have those things. Right. You'll make sure that meal now, because they're coming over, is going to be absent those things because you love that person enough to modify your position even on what you like to eat because you want to make that person feel loved. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of that in this situation comes down. It doesn't really matter to me where they land at. The question really is, from a relational perspective, how do you go forward?
I've had many people do that for me as a recovering alcoholic. Still to this day, I go out and they're worried about drinking in front of me, and I'll say, no, don't worry about it. Like, right. I mean, if early on, it's different, but I mean, you got to live in this world. And so I think that, so you are weaker on the front end where you're like thankful that people wouldn't do that in front of you. But then at the end of the day, you get to a point where, if your heart's in a good spot and you're healthy with the Lord, then people can have a glass of wine in front of you and it doesn't cause the alcoholic to stumble.
Yeah, I see this issue as really the same thing about alcohol. I mean, there's people who would say, yeah, I get it. There's some license I can take. I'm not to be inebriated, not to be drunk, but I can have a glass of wine. But if that's something that you find is just, even that's too far, why do it if you don't have to?
Yeah, exactly.
Then just don't do it. If you're with that person matters to you.
Yep.
Yeah, and in Heidi's case, too, she was concerned because this other couple that were with her and her boyfriend and his family, they're not even Christians. Right. And so here comes the Christians here are the ones that are okay with I think it was the unbelieving couple who brought the marijuana, but everybody was fine with it except for Heidi.
Right.
So,
right. Well,
she's just concerned that...
This tells you going forward, make these decisions. These are there are certain things you would say that are behaviors of your in-law that you're willing to kind of overlook, right? Because you're not going to be living with your in-laws. You're living with their child. So then the question becomes, well, does he support their position? Then you're going to be butting your head against this for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. So what about those in jail, Jim? They're doing time because of marijuana usage. And now it's legal in certain states.
I can tell you that in California, we've emptied out for the most part, large populations from the jail system here because it was an opportunity to kind of right the ship financially as a state goes. So several years ago, we used to be that if you had possession of a drug on the street, you would go to jail that night for a felony, and you would go 24 hours later, 48 hours later, you'd be arraigned in front of a judge, and you'd actually be held. Now, that's the kind of thing that we cite out, and nobody stays in jail for those kinds of things. We've emptied out those facilities. Now, what'll happen is, after a period of time, the pendulum swings in a certain direction, and then it'll swing back. But right now, we're in California. We're in the mind, kind of the mental state of releasing people more than holding people.
It's being mindful and applying the principles of self-control. Having self-control is part of the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5. Just that whole chapter just talks about, having self-control of the fruits of, and then the different fruits of the Spirit. But there's a couple things that I want to mention. In the video, the guy mentioned that we need to be sober-minded, and that is in 1 Peter chapter 5 verses 8, and I did talk about having self-control, and that is in Galatians 5. But then in Proverbs 25:28 it says this: a man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. So it's the idea that there is a city, it has no protection. Anything, you are just open to any type of attack. Anybody could just come in and take whatever they want to take. You don't want that in your life, in your house. You have a door, you have locks. The whole idea is having self-control, is being guarded. And then the last thing that I want to just touch on a little bit is the fact that, wine is a blessing from God. And not a lot of people or pastors in the church talk about this. In Matthew 11:19 and in Luke chapter 7 verse 34, Jesus drank wine. Okay, so that's number one. Jesus did drink wine. And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 7, it says, "Go then, eat your bread in happiness, and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works." And then Proverbs 3 verses 9 through 10, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine." And so my whole point in bringing that up is the fact that wine is considered to be a blessing from God. And so I just want to end by saying this. Hebrews 12:1, it says this, "Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." What is that season that God has you in so that you can endure? Okay, it's enduring. It's not just, okay, I'm in the race. I'm in the race and I need to endure. What do I need to lay down that is a weight, that is dragging me down, that is not allowing me to finish this? What is that's causing me to stumble, or that's causing me to slow down in my walk? Okay, and so that is one thing that I wanted to bring up. And so Hebrews 12:1 is a really good example of some of the things that sometimes each season in our walk we need to reevaluate. We need to ask God, exactly what do I need to lay down? There's openly blatant sin, and then there's weights that, it's not bad, but it's not beneficial for me to endure. Okay, and I hope that was clear, and I hope that this was an encouragement for you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know down in the comments below your opinions, and if I missed something, let me know in the comments below as well. And cheers. Thank you guys so much for watching. You be blessed.